Hi all, in this video we are going to start implementing Spring Security in our RESTful web application. We are going to follow a sequence of steps so we are clear with what we are trying to achieve. And in few cases what we will do is we'll try to revisit the step to complete the implementation of that particular module, or you can say the particular step. So far what we have is, you can see in the image here, what we have is we have a airline REST service application which is running inside an embedded Tomcat server, and we have a flight resource. Okay, and the client that we are using is Postman. So any request that we make, it directly goes to the flight resource, and in return we get the response, right? So what we're going to do is we are going to add Spring Security API in our pom.xml as a dependency. That is going to be our very first step. So if you go back to our application here, and if you right click on the application and go to Spring options, add status, and in here I'll expand the security and check the Spring Security and click on next. It's going to show me the conflict that we have with the initializer and the one that is in our current application. So I'm going to select all here and then finish. So what it did is it added two dependencies, that is for the security, Spring Boot Starter Security and Spring Security Test. Okay, so now what is going to happen is, now when the Spring Boot application, or you can say the application starts, Spring Boot is going to auto configure all the APIs that are in the class path. So now it sees, okay, there is a Spring Boot starter security, that means Spring Security in the class path, so it has to configure the security, right? So let's see what happens when we start the application and try to access the resource. What it's going to do. And you can see in the log, you can see something new is added. Previously we did not see anything like this. Now it is saying that using generated security password, so it printed a password for us. How that is going to be used, we can see that later, but for now let's go to our Postman and try to access it. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'll go to the Postman. Okay, so here if I try to send, I'm getting a 401, that is unauthorized response. So what is happening is, if I go to, I can do that even in browser. Let me try to access it. Localhost 8080 flight 20, and you can see that my request is getting redirected to a login page. This is something that we never added, right? So who's adding this? This is Spring Security that is redirecting our request, that is unauthorized the request, to a login page. This is something by default it gives. This is a default page given to the user by the Spring Security. So what is happening in the backend? So as I said, that now Spring Boot is going to configure Spring Security and place it before our resource that is here, and all the requests now coming from the client has to go through this Spring Security API. Okay, and on success the request is going to be forwarded to the flight, and then in return we'll get the response. But if there is an exception thrown in the security API that is here, then we get a access denied response, the one that we saw here in our Postman. Okay, so when you're trying to access, definitely when you're trying to access it through web, it gets redirected to to a login page, but whereas through Postman it is giving us this response, right, a JSON response. So what is this security API here? So consider this when you go to the now if you look at the Spring Security documentation, let me bring that up here. So it is basically a sequence of filters, okay, that your request go through. Okay, let me bring that in a big picture here. You can see that it's a filter chain. Okay, if you scroll down, and you can see that you have lots of filters that your request goes through. So you can see that these are the filter chain, security filters, and you don't need to remember all these filters, but you know, if you're doing a Spring certification, you might be asked for the order of few of the security filters, because the order really matters. Okay, because when you're trying to do a custom configuration, you might deal with the ordering of the security filters. So here I said your request, when it comes in, it goes through all these filters, that is a filter chain, and on successful validation, or you can say that on success, your request is then forwarded to the controller, that is in our case is the flight resource, and on unsuccessful or any exception is thrown, then the request goes and then the request is returned as an access denied response, that is here. You can see in the big picture, right? So we won't be discussing much about in detail of all these filters, but we might use a few of them and also go through a few of the filters when we are diving deep into the configuration part. But for now, you just remember that whenever you make a request, now we have added a security in front of our all the resources. Okay, so any request that goes in has to go through this security plugin, or you can say security framework, and then to our actual endpoints. Okay, so that is what we got in our that's what we that got added by just adding the dependency here. And how do we then get the how do we use this password? Okay, so let's copy this and go back to our browser, and here what I'm going to do is I'm going to use username as user and make this password and try to sign in. Let's see what happens, and you can see that I get the response. Okay, so by default the username is user, and the password that got generated here, it's a one-time password, that is whenever the server starts or the application starts, you get this password, and this gets created. This is a random password that gets created every time the application starts. Okay, so this is something that default we can use for every start of the application. So this everything that you see is default, right? So what we do, but this is not a real-time scenario, right? We want to have a control over all the configurations. We can't use something that is generated here, right? So we're going to move on to our next step by creating the custom configuration. Okay, so how we're going to do that? Let's see. So first, let me stop the server, and let me create a package called config, and I'll create a class here, and the class name would be app security configuration, or config. App security, I have a typo here, security config, right? Okay, so this is this configuration is going to be the one that is going that will be used to do all the configuration for our, or you can say that it's going to override the default configuration that comes with the Spring Security. So what we're trying to do is we are trying to say, hey, don't use the default configuration of the Spring Security. I want to override it. And how do we override it? We try to create a custom configuration for that. So that's what we're going to do here. So what I'm going to do is, first I'm going to annotate this as configuration, because this is a configuration file. Okay, the next annotation that I'm going to use is enable web security. Enable web security here. Okay, so now we can go ahead and do all the we can write all the logic here, but it's always recommended to use something that, and this is what, not recommended, but it's also a standard that we use some of the APIs that comes with Spring Security, and then try to override few of the logic that we want to really, we want to have a custom implementation of that. So here what we're going to do is we're going to extend a class from Spring Security API, that is Spring Web Security Configurer Adapter. Okay, so you can see that this class comes in from the Spring Security framework, and it has all the default configuration or implementations, and we are going to override it here in this class. Whichever we want to have a custom implementation, we're going to do that here. Okay, so far we are good. We have now a custom configuration, and we will move forward and add all those logic here, the custom configuration logic here. But before that, we have to do some more steps, advanced step, like creating user table, roles table, and all those. So what we're trying to do here is we are going to do the authentication and authorization from the database, okay, by using the username and password. So it's going to be a username and password authentication using the database. So that is what we are going to achieve in this configuration, that is web configuration. Okay, but remember that depending on the application, there might be multiple mechanisms used for authentication and authorization, right? The main purpose of any security is two things: achieving authentication and authorization, right? That is something that that we want with any security implementation. First is the authentication. On successful authentication, then what we do is we get the authorization, right? So now, for example, we can have the authentication done before the request gets to the application. That means we can have pre-authenticated request coming to our application. Example, SiteMinder, right, where the authentication is done through SiteMinder, and the SiteMinder then forwards the user ID or username in the request, and then using that user ID we build the user object in our application, right? So that is one mechanism, and you can, if you look at the documentation of Spring, you can find those authentication mechanism, like see here you have, and the one that we, as I said, we are going to use username and password mechanism, but you can see that there are different mechanisms that we can use depending on the project that you're working on. Like the one that I said, it is the one pre-authenticated scenario, that is example SiteMinder. If you're using OpenID, that is another example of authentication mechanism. So but at the very high level, you need to remember that the steps that we're going to follow remains the same. It's just that there might be few APIs here and there that you will need to use depending on the requirement or the mechanism that you're using, but the steps and the flow is still going to be the same. Okay, it has the request is still the request will still go through your filter chain, and then on successful authentication or authorization, it's going to the request will be forwarded to your controller, that is the endpoint. So that all flow is still going to be the same. It is just in your logic here that you're going to do the custom configuration. That is where you're going to change a little depending on the authentication mechanism that you're going to use, right? Hope you understand that. But as I said, in our course we are going to use username and password authentication using database. Okay, so that's all for this video, and in the next session what we're going to do is we are going to do some step on the username, that is the user table and the role table, and build our backend part, and then we are going to come back to our step 1 and do some configuration. That's all for this video, and I'll see you in the next. Thank you.